On October the 30th, 1991, as President George H.W. Bush is opening the Madrid Conference to consider land for peace in Israel's Middle East role, an impending perfect storm travels 1,000 miles from east to west instead of the normal west to east pattern and crashes into the New England coast. 35-foot waves crash into the Kennebunkport home of President Bush. On August the 23rd of 1992, when the Madrid Conference, moved to Washington, D.C., resumes, Hurricane Andrew, the worst natural disaster ever to hit America up until that date, comes ashore, produces an estimated $30 billion in damage, leaving 180,000 people homeless in Florida. On January the 16th, 1994, President Bill Clinton meets with Syria's President Hafez el-Assad in Geneva. They talk about a peace agreement with Israel that includes Israel giving up the Golan Heights. Within 24 hours, a powerful 6.9 earthquake rocks Southern California. This quake, centered in Northridge, becomes the second most destructive natural disaster to hit the United States, behind Hurricane Andrew. On September the 28th, 1998, as Secretary of State Madeleine Albright works on the final details of an agreement in which Israel would give up land for peace, President Clinton meets with Yasser Arafat and Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House to finalize this land deal. As the meeting happens, Hurricane George pounds the Gulf Coast, causing $1 billion in damage. At the exact time that Arafat departs the country, the storm begins to subside. On November the 30th, 1998, Yasser Arafat comes to Washington again to meet with President Clinton to raise money for a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. Clinton promises him $400 million. And on the same day, the Dow Jones average drops 216 points, and on December the 1st, a few days later, the European market had its third worst day in history. Hundreds of billions of dollars of market capitalization were wiped out in the United States and Europe within 3 days. On June the 28th, 2001, the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat achieves a stunning diplomatic coup when he wins the support of the United States for a monitoring force to oversee a Middle East ceasefire. In the months of July and August of 2001, Israel advances several raids into the West Bank in order to stem the tide of increasing violence against Israel. The United States and Great Britain consistently, strongly, and publicly condemn Israel's actions. On September the 10th, 2001, Time magazine announces that Ariel Sharon is under immense pressure. The article notes that Palestinian Yasser Arafat at a United Nations conference just a few days earlier had condemned what he called Israel's colonial racist plot against the Palestinians. On September the 11th, 2001, the first and largest attack on the U.S. mainland occurs, killing over 3,000 innocent U.S. civilians, carried out by Arab terrorists, the mirror of what Israel had been fighting for decades. In August of 2005, Israel carried out the evacuation of 9,500 residents from Gush Katif and 4 Samaria communities. Residents were forced from their homes by Israeli troops, some dragged away kicking and screaming and placed on buses that took them from the area. The withdrawal was backed by the U.S. government and specific declarations and negotiations of President George Bush. 1 week later, Hurricane Katrina made landfall, forcing the evacuation and displacement of hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens. More than 1,800 people lost their lives in Katrina, and more than $81 billion in damages occurred. In November of 2007, the Annapolis Conference convened. In this conference, President Bush was pressuring Israel to accept the roadmap to peace. Under this plan, Israel was being pressured once again to give up land in exchange for peace. Our current economic crisis began in the same month, November 2007. On April the 19th, 2010, Israel was celebrating its Independence Day. On that same day, Fox News reported the Obama administration's shift towards Israel in the UN Security Council. April the 20th, the next day, the Deepwater Horizon rig blew, creating the worst environmental disaster the United States has ever seen. That story is still not over, and that disaster may wind up affecting major parts of the world. Are these 10 disastrous events simply coincidence, or are they the hand and judgment of God? And if they are the hand and judgment of God, what judgments are yet to come as we continue to turn our back on Israel?
That was my good friend Carl Gallups and P.P. Simmons. There are consequences to abusing Israel. There are blessings when we bless Israel. That's a simple Bible verse, and I'll get into that just a little bit later. I want to thank you for coming back. I want to thank you for even, I've met so many of you during the lunch break that are from many points far and wide, Virginia, oh my goodness, all over. And we give you, by the way, Minnesota winter begins in 3 days. So get out of town fast. Get out of Dodge real fast. Yeah. I'm living proof you can survive wind chills at 70 below zero last winter. So that's what's going to begin here. A few days. Anyway. Okay, what I wanted to do for the next few minutes is look at how U.S. presidents, not all of them, but some in the recent, since about 1917, I'll explain that, have either blessed or cursed God's covenant land and people. And there indeed are consequences when that happens. Obviously, the nation, the church, the denomination, the conference, the individual, according to Genesis 12:3, who blesses that land and people will be blessed. And those who curse her, and throughout history, I'm going to show you what happens when, in fact, we do come against God's people. I happen to be starting with President Woodrow Wilson for a particular reason, and that is 1913, 1921, for those of you listening on CD rather than DVD. It was under his administration that really that little fledgling state of Israel was going to start to be born, because that was when the Balfour Declaration would come about. And his father instilled in him a great love for the Jews. And it was during his administration that these two people, James Balfour and Chaim Weizmann, were meeting to draw up that Balfour Declaration. Against all odds, President Woodrow Wilson went along with all of this. The Balfour Declaration, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. Now, obviously, there's going to be much turmoil that was going to come about because of this, but that's not my purpose today. But like Harry Truman, Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat who stood for the Jews. He was also relentless against anti-Semitism, and he said, "How proud I am that because of the teachings instilled in me by my father, it has been my privilege to restore the Holy Land to its rightful owners." So that was the beginnings of Zionism, the beginnings of that Jewish state, and the beginnings of America getting involved. Now, interestingly enough, he appointed a Jewish Supreme Court justice. Oh my goodness, the firestorm. Louis Brandeis, back in 1916, Washington exploded. We can't have a Jew in this position of Supreme Court. And Woodrow Wilson stood by his pick of Mr. Brandeis. Okay, we're going to move on and skip the next two. I'll just touch on them very, very briefly. But Mr. Harding, President Harding, was only in office a couple of years, and he did not really want to get involved with the Jewish people. And here's the important thing: is now immigration issues entered the picture. And also, another thing that was going to enter the picture was rabid anti-Semitism in America. And it was mainly perpetrated, at least it was initiated. Obviously, this devil has been stirring this up since the beginning of time. But in the case of the 1920s, it was Henry Ford, his Dearborn Independent, and he kept insisting that the world's entire problems were because of the dominance of the Jewish people. And he launched a vicious attack against them. And even Calvin Coolidge said, I don't want to get involved. He didn't get involved. Coolidge, again, he dealt with immigration issues, which made the entry of Jews into America next to impossible, other than a few thousand who could get in. But this next gentleman was going to be a little bit different. Obviously, his administration is marred by the Depression, but nonetheless, he's the first Quaker to become president of the United States, and he was an ardent supporter of Israel. Now, as I talk about these men, none of them are perfect. None of us are perfect. Their administrations, and I'm not looking at their administrations necessarily, they're Democrat, Republican, yes, but that's not my purpose, is to highlight liberal, conservative at all. But it is to focus in on how they perceived this little blossoming state of Israel. And did we come alongside, or did we neglect? And we'll see more and more. A lot of them neglected, we'll see here as we move along. So Herbert Hoover says, I have watched with genuine admiration the steady and unmistakable progress made in the rehabilitation of Palestine. The only thing is, he was one of many who wanted it in Africa. There were even Zionists who wanted it in Africa because it would be away from the Arab influence. They felt it would be safer. And Herbert Hoover felt it should be either Tanzania, Kenya, or Uganda. Obviously, that was not God's intent, and that's not obviously what happened. But Herbert Hoover, he aided Jews devastated by World War I and the pogroms. He supported the Jewish state entirely. He supported the rescue of Jews from the Holocaust. The next administration, however, was a disaster. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933 to 1945. And Mr. Roosevelt, even though he was known not to be not a friend of the Jews, they voted for him 90% of the time. And he was concerned about angering the Arab world, for one thing. But there were other reasons. He maybe will never ever be known as to why he was going to abandon the Jews. Here's where a warning comes in that I want to bring out from the Bible. It's the Jeremiah 16 warning. And there we read, Behold, I am going to send for many fishermen, declares the Lord, and they will fish for them, and afterwards I will send for many hunters, and they will hunt for them from every mountain and every hill, and from the clefts of the rocks. What is that all about? Well, here's what many believe it's about. Were the fishermen the Zionists of the 20s and 30s who told the Jews, get out of Germany? As a matter of fact, get out of Europe if you can. The 20s and 30s. By and large, they did not listen, or they couldn't afford it, or most of them just didn't think things would get as bad as they were going to get. Were the hunters then the Nazis who came and hunted them from every mountain and every hill and from the clefts of the rocks? So that was the Jeremiah 16 warning. And moving on here with Franklin Roosevelt, books were going to be written about his involvement, or maybe I should say lack of involvement, with the Jews during the Holocaust, while 6 million died. A chronicle of American apathy. Another book would be written, FDR and the Jews. As a matter of fact, I mean, the apathy was going to be, I'm going to tell you about plenty of the apathy. Kristallnacht, 1938, when the Jewish businesses were all destroyed in Germany. All Franklin Roosevelt did was recall the U.S. ambassador. There really was no official kind of a protest. And he had been in office, Roosevelt had been in office only 1 week when the first concentration camp, Dachau, went up in 1933. He knew, he chose to look the other way. He refused to let some 900 Jews into came on the ship the St. Louis, and May 1939 wanted to get into America. Many nations wouldn't let this ship in, but America wouldn't let them in. They finally went back to Germany. Many of those 900 perished in the ovens of Germany, but America turned its back. Many have said that Israel would not have become a nation had Franklin Roosevelt been president in 1948. Obviously, God had other ideas and was going to remove him. And then the Roosevelt administration had been encouraged to bomb the railroad tracks into the camps that would at least halt the immigration of those who were going to be sent to concentration camps, and a spokesman simply said such an operation would in any case be of such doubtful efficacy that it would not warrant the use of our resources. In other words, the Jews aren't worth our resources in America to save them. That's the Roosevelt administration. Yet 90% of the Jews would vote for him. He willingly, knowingly looked the other way. Just what was at the real root of it, I'm not sure anybody other than great insiders would ever know that. But then the tide turned, obviously, with this man, Harry Truman, 1945 to 1953. Harry Truman had parents who loved the Lord, who loved the Jewish people, told him to do so. And beyond that, Harry Truman had a good friend. His name was Eddie Jacobson, Jewish man. They were in World War I together. They were in business together. Anything Eddie Jacobson said to Harry Truman on his shoulder, he listened. Eddie Jacobson said, "You get involved in this little struggling state of Israel, Palestine, that's going to become Israel. Get involved." And Harry Truman listened. And he met with Chaim Weizmann in 1947. Because the state was in the process of becoming an official nation, not quite, but it was almost there. And obviously it did happen in May of 1948. And just 12 minutes after it declared its independent status, Harry Truman said, "One of the proudest days of my life occurred at 6:12 p.m. Friday, May 14th, 1948, when I was able to announce recognition of the new state of Israel by the government of the United States in view of the long friendship of the American people for the Zionist ideal. It was particularly appropriate that our government should be the first to recognize the new state." That was 1948. When we look at the present, we've gone a long way in the wrong direction, but I am getting ahead of myself. He, obviously, in the next election, not only was he expected to lose, they said there's no way he could win, Harry Truman, because there were 3 Democrats running, and they were going to cancel each other out. Dewey was a slam dunk, no-brainer winner. It was a given. Well, God had other thoughts. Did he honor Harry Truman for his strong stand for Israel? I don't know. It's possible. I would say that's even likely. And Harry Truman's burden would be the Jewish refugees in the displaced persons camps in Europe, by the way, which is where Anita Dittman was. And she was able to get into America thanks to Mr. Truman, because he sent a rep to those displaced persons camps, and he was just appalled at what he learned. And so he allowed 80,000 Jewish refugees to get into America in the mid and late 1940s. So a great friend of Israel. However, when that War of Independence came along in 1948, remember, Israel was a nation, and within hours, these Arab armies descended on her to annihilate her because this cancer had moved into their territory. Truman and the State Department wanted no involvement whatsoever. They would not arm the Jews. America stood on the sidelines, as was going to be another president here in a little while. But Ben-Gurion said we have only a 50-50 chance of survival if someone doesn't get involved with us and help us in this war of independence. Nobody did. They had only 9 obsolete airplanes, and this little ragtag bunch of Holocaust survivors defeated these Arab armies. One of the miracles of the 20th century, without a doubt. Even though America didn't get involved, no one got involved. God got involved. That's all you need. This is perhaps the mystery of all presidents, and Dwight Eisenhower liberated the camps. He was horrified at what he and his troops came across. He said to the troops, he said, "Take pictures. No one will believe us if you don't take pictures." And so they took pictures. And it was quite a sight. He was very, very troubled, obviously, by man's inhumanity to man. Yet, Dwight Eisenhower would go on. The Eisenhower years were going to become, and were called, the coldest years in Israel-U.S. history, including the Carter years. Israel's socialism bothered Dwight Eisenhower, and the Arabs offered containment of communism, and that was huge to Eisenhower. So he opted to show his support of the Arab kingdoms, the Arab world, and oil, and he abandoned Israel. And this man was speaking into him. All these men have men on their shoulders whispering in their ear. John Foster Dulles was very troubled by the Jewish influence that dominated the scene. That was the quote here. The Israeli embassy is practically dictating to Congress through influential Jewish people in America. Well, with a voice like that speaking into Dwight Eisenhower, you can imagine he wasn't too friendly to the Jewish people. And then February 1957, Eisenhower joined with 75 other nations in the UN General Assembly in passing a resolution deploring Israel's occupation of Sinai. Well, along came a gentleman who would be a friend of Israel, John Kennedy, 1961 to 63, but he had one huge hurdle to overcome, namely his father, who was a well-known anti-Semitic fellow. He hated the Jews. Kennedy was able to hurdle that somehow. Actually, John Kennedy said way back in March of 1956, before he was president, he said, "It's time that the nations of the world in the Middle East and elsewhere realize that Israel is here to stay. She will not surrender, she will not retreat, and we will not let her fall." He had to deal with Golda Meir. He was actually the first president to sell arms to Israel. He tripled the amount of financial aid America gave to Israel. He was a good friend of Israel, but his brother Robert was as well. Robert Kennedy, assassinated in 1968 by a Palestinian, Sirhan. Both Kennedys were very troubled by the treatment of Soviet Jews. And John Kennedy's foreign policy, they said, could be summed up in 3 words: Nasser, Nasser, Nasser. That's all he could really think about in that region of the world, was subduing Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. So he took his eyes a little bit off of Israel to focus on containing the Arab world. And when he died, they built a memorial, John F. Kennedy Memorial in Jerusalem. Now we come to an administration that is truly mysterious. You'll never believe that Lyndon Johnson was called a righteous Gentile, and I'll explain why. Again, we can have disagreements with these gentlemen's politics, and I certainly do with some of them, probably all of them. But when it comes to how they treated the nation of Israel and the Jewish people, well, that was kind of a different story. He had a grandfather who said, "Take care of the Jews, God's chosen people, consider them your friends, and help them any way you can." Another thing influenced Lyndon Johnson, and that was back in 1945. He took a trip to Dachau. That left him apparently shaken, stunned, bursting with overpowering revulsion and incredulous horror. It stuck in his mind what had happened. Not only that, but somehow, and just what the connection was, I'm not sure that history is revealing, Lady Bird Johnson would say sometime later, person after person plucked at my sleeve and said, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for your husband, Lyndon Johnson. He helped me out of Europe. So during the war, he somehow got a number of Jews out of Europe into Texas. Again, I'm not sure exactly what the connection was, but he was able to do that, and because of that, he's often been called a righteous Gentile by the Jews. Now, again, as with Truman, he wanted no involvement in the Six-Day War. He sat it out, and complete neutrality, and that war could have been avoided if America and NATO had warned Egypt and Syria against aggression. The world sat it out, that incredible Six-Day War. How many wars last only 6 days? In history, how many last 6 days? Well, when God's involved, because no nation would get involved with Israel in her Six-Day War. When God gets involved, again, it doesn't matter if anybody else is involved. And America benefited with the defeat of Egypt and Syria. But again, she totally stayed out of the Six-Day War. And then Lyndon Johnson, after the Six-Day War, told Israel to keep all the territory it had won in the Six-Day War. We now come to a gentleman, Richard Nixon, 1969 to 74. Again, quite an enigma, because 500 hours of tapes reveal him to be not only anti-Semitic, let's just call it what it is. He couldn't stand the Jews. He knew they'd never vote for him, but he was paranoid of the Jewish people, particularly in Washington. He had to work with Golda Meir, and believe it or not, Golda Meir was going to call Richard Nixon Israel's savior. Now, why was that? Well, we got another war. How can this little nation the size of New Jersey, and she's got the War of Independence, she's got the Sinai War, she's got the Six-Day War, she's got the Yom Kippur War, because no one will leave her alone. So Golda Meir asked Richard Nixon to get involved, and she said to her sister in America, if it hadn't been for Richard Nixon, Israel would have been destroyed in the Yom Kippur War. This is a man who hated the Jews. What happened? He turned it around. As a matter of fact, he sent the Sixth Fleet off of the coast of that region. And one of the reasons he sent the Sixth Fleet was the Soviet Union sent a fleet to get involved in that Yom Kippur War and possibly go in and obliterate Israel. And Nixon said to the Soviets, you get involved, that's grounds for World War III, you will be obliterated. This is a man who doesn't like the Jews. Did God move on his heart? Apparently. I don't know that there's any other explanation. This man who spoke into his ear was not particularly helpful. Henry Kissinger, he told Israel, don't you dare make a preemptive attack. You're going to be annihilated, but don't make a preemptive attack. And Israel was outnumbered 12-1 on the ground. But America, and mainly Kissinger, said don't make a preemptive attack. In other words, sit there and be annihilated. But Nixon overruled everything and did what he could, and God used Richard Nixon to save the nation of Israel at that time, 1973. Gerald Ford, another friend of Israel, he was very, very concerned about Soviet Jewry, and he said, Israel will not negotiate with the PLO. Wouldn't it be nice if we heard that more often? Israel will not negotiate with the PLO. Negotiations between Israel and the Arabs should be quid pro quo. If Israel gives something up, she should get something in return. Yet he said to many, he said that I cannot conceive of America selling out Israel. Obviously not in office very long. And the man who came in after him, a disaster. Other than the current occupant, absolutely the worst. He would become one of Israel's greatest adversaries. And the infamous Camp David Accords in March of 1979, and he said after this signing, he said, "Now world peace is possible." Oh, really? These two little kingdoms, Israel and parts of the Arab world, in this case Egypt, make peace, and now world peace is possible. Okay, well, delusion. As soon as he said that, he then turned on the Jews, and I mean turned on the Jews. He abandoned the Shah of Iran. The Shah couldn't even get medical treatment in America because of Jimmy Carter. And what did this usher in? I'm going to say right up front, it ushered in our war on terror. The Ayatollah Khomeini came in 1979. It was just about the time I was getting acquainted with Anita Dittman in the front row here. It was again, I was 4 years old, remember? 1979, the Ayatollah gets involved, and we have our global war on terror. Would that not have happened had Jimmy Carter not abandoned the Shah? Who knows? We simply don't know. And even out of office, he has continued to hammer and slander and lie against the nation of Israel. Peace, not apartheid. Even though Arabs serve in her parliament and they're welcome as citizens in the nation of Israel, Carter went on to be a friend of terrorists. He said recently that the Gazans, the Arabs living in Gaza, which Israel gave up only 10 years ago, are being treated like animals. Well, it's true. Treated by animals, like animals by the Hamas leaders and others in Arab authority over them. But he was making the accusation that the Jews are treating the Gazans like animals. I'm sure Steve Curry would denounce that as well. A great friend of Israel here, Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 1989. Even as governor of California in the 60s, he stood up for Israel, solid friend. He denounced the PLO. He stood with her in that six-day war as governor of California. One of the reasons he called the Soviet Union the evil empire was because of the way the Soviets treated the Jews. That made them an evil empire, in part anyway. Yitzhak Shamir came along and said, "This is the best administration we have worked with to date." So they had not a perfect relationship, they had a good relationship, not perfect. The AWACS, he sold planes to the Saudis, AWACS planes. So it wasn't perfect, because none of these people are perfect, but it was a good relationship, and this one was not. George Herbert Walker Bush, 89 to 93. It was well known that he was not comfortable with the Jewish influence in Washington. And of course, under his watch came that Persian Gulf War. Israel attacked in 1991, and Israel was told, restrain, don't retaliate, don't do it. In other words, just let those scuds fall on you and look the other way. And that's what they did. You know, their boss had spoken. You can't defend yourself. So they didn't. George Herbert Walker Bush did send some U.S. troops. It did have a relatively happy ending. It certainly could have been far, far worse. So he actually closed the dialogue with the PLO. James Baker and George Herbert Walker Bush closed dialogue with the PLO. But all in all, it was not a very successful administration when it came to how the United States dealt with the nation of Israel. Now, this was going to be a real enigma, because Bill Clinton was the one president, and I'm quoting historians now, he knew he needed to tap into Jewish genius, and therefore he had more advisors, counselors, pollsters, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members who were Jews than any other president ever. He had to tap into Jewish genius. And he did. And most of us remember this dreadful day. Again, this handshake, supposedly world peace now possible. Such strong delusion, world peace, when two of these kingdoms here, Israel and the Arab world, shake hands, the Oslo Accords of 1993. There's much I could say about that, but I won't. They went on in 2000 at Camp David. Ehud Barak, one of Israel's most liberal presidents ever, and Arafat met at Camp David in 2000, and Barak offered Arafat 98% of what he wanted. In other words, he offered him the candy in the candy store. He offered him everything, practically. And Arafat turned it down. Bill Clinton said, Arafat's rejection of my proposal after Ehud Barak accepted it was an error of historic proportions, Bill Clinton said. Well, it was a no-brainer. Why? Arafat doesn't want peace. He wants war. He went back to the Palestinian areas and was received as a hero for not caving to all the things, 98% of what he wanted offered to him by Ehud Barak. He turned it down. He came back. He was a hero because this element doesn't want peace. They want the annihilation of the nation of Israel. And yet the world can't seem to get that through their head. They just can't. Okay, well, another kind of a strange situation here. George W. Bush was actually called Mr. Palestine. He wanted a Palestinian state by 2005. He came up with that horrific roadmap for peace. He endorsed the disengagement from Gaza. And one of his biggest problems was this person. Not that Condoleezza Rice wasn't a lovely Secretary of State and a lovely Christian. Problem is, she was replacement theology Christian. She believed the church is the new Israel. There's no relevance for this reborn nation of Israel. Do you see what bad theology, the wreckage it creates throughout the world? So she kept advising him wrong because of her replacement theology. She's known to be a born-again Christian. But when you come from the replacement theology camp, your perception is just completely twisted. This is when Bill Koenig, our good friend here at this ministry, was writing his book, Eye to Eye, Facing the Consequences of Dividing Israel, which is what part of that P.P. Simmons video is based on, Bill Koenig's findings. And that would be 24 to 48 hours after America, it did something terrible to Israel. Koenig went back to Bush 41, Bill Clinton, Bush 43. Within 24 to 48 hours, catastrophe fell on America. So the Gaza situation came along, and the Jewish people said, Bush and Sharon have declared war on God and the Bible. What's going on? We're being forced to give away our precious land. And what happens when we give away our precious land? Terrorists take it over and lob missiles on us, which is exactly what happened. Because land for peace just leaves Israel in pieces. It doesn't work. But the politicians and pundits of the world can only think, if Israel will just give up land, there will be peace. All it does is leave Israel in pieces. Now I'm going to spend a little extra time in this category right now. There's a stir in the audience here. I wonder why. Barack Hussein Obama. There should have been an immediate, and there was, warning when Ingrid Mattson of the Islamic Society of North America took part in his inauguration festivities in 2009. That was a huge tip-off, and it wasn't even subtle. Israel has been consistently called an occupier, won't make bold gestures for peace. Again, she's giving away all sorts of things, willing to give away even more. And in what I've been reading in the last few days, there's even talk Netanyahu's possibly been persuaded to think about 1967 borders. I don't know where that's going as I speak, because I could not check media this morning. This is the first person he called in office. On his inauguration day, he called the head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. This is the man who financed the 1972 Munich slaughter of Jewish athletes in Munich, Germany. He financed it. It's the first person Barack Obama called. This was the turning point in history. Anybody who's studying the geopolitics and the Bible will tell you this is when perilous times went into overdrive, June '09. In June '09, Barack Obama addressed the Cairo University and he addressed the Muslim world. I'm not saying he really even addressed the Arab world, he addressed the Muslim world. Hosni Mubarak was not invited, the president of Egypt. Honored guests, the Muslim Brotherhood. Terrorists, in other words. And in that speech, he compared the suffering of the Palestinians as comparable to the suffering of the Jews during the Holocaust. By 2010, Israel's ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, said Israel's ties with the United States are a crisis of historic proportions, 2010. We're soon going to hear Barack Obama say the future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam. We're soon going to learn that prominent Muslims were taking office within the administration, as heavily the Muslim Brotherhood was making inroads. And I'm not going to name the names of those who were working with them. I mean, it's not a secret, Huma Abedin and others. This man, Mohammed Ali Biari, went on the Homeland Security Advisory Council in 2010. His mentor was Ayatollah Khomeini. He is a supporter of the Caliphate. He's a proponent of the Muslim Brotherhood. He may be the man behind Obama saying ISIS is not Muslim, is not Islam. He may be the man behind that. He did step down after pressure. He stepped down from that Homeland Security Advisory Council. The liberal Washington Post said, Obama is treating Benjamin Netanyahu like an unsavory third world dictator. So it's obvious to the whole world. In 2011, Barack Obama said Israel's Palestinian partner is sincere in wanting a peaceful settlement. Really? Could have fooled me. I'll be. On election night, November 2012, Israel can only rely on herself. Obama prefers the Arab world over the Western world, including Israel. That was her Knesset election night, November 2012. Israel can only rely on herself. Well, you know what? God kind of likes that because eventually they'll rely on him. But first, they've got to get rid of their reliance on America. And Barack Obama has certainly assisted in that process. And then in November of 2013, P5+1, John Kerry and Barack Obama allow Iran to build a nuke. Other nations went along with that, but it was spurred on by John Kerry and Barack Obama. In March of 2014, Obama states the Palestinians do not have to recognize Israel's legitimate existence. Now, he also appoints some others in his administration that are not helpful in this scenario. Chuck Hagel is warning the world about Christian Zionists, and he calls them roadblocks to peace. John Brennan, converted to Islam, calls Hezbollah moderate, calls Jerusalem by its Arab name Al-Quds, not Jerusalem. This is, can you imagine what's going through Israel's head? Well, as a matter of fact, I have a picture that's going to show you that in a moment. But now we come to the summer of 2014 and the Gaza war. It gets more absurd, if that's possible, because they're fighting for their very life with thousands of rockets falling on them for 24 hours a day, practically. And during that time in July, Obama calls for an immediate, unconditional ceasefire that will leave Hamas rockets and attack plans intact. The Kerry-Obama wrecking ball intervention powers empowers the terrorist government of Hamas bent on destroying Israel. Times of Israel said that. Obama-Kerry, they empower the government bent on destroying Israel. Obama-Kerry offer Hamas $47 million to rebuild their terror network to further destroy Israel. You wonder why we have Ebola entering into America, we have beheadings entering into America, we have a southern border with unspeakable things crossing our southern border. You cannot violate Genesis 12:3 and get away with it. You cannot. You cannot. Now, Benjamin Netanyahu is without words here, but the expression probably says it all. He says this is lunacy diplomacy. And it is lunacy diplomacy. He says, I'll shake his hand, but I'm not going to smile about it. Here are the nations that are financing Gaza. Do you think they're short of nickels? Every developed nation in the world is financing Gaza. And how are they taking those nickels and dimes? All they're doing is turning them into weaponry to obliterate Israel. Every developed nation in the world, and a few undeveloped, involved in sending aid to terrorists in Gaza. Of course, Israel shouldn't have given up Gaza in 2005, but that came about because of the pressure of George W. Bush. Ynet News says this administration is closer today to Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood or to Iran, which encourage terror, than to Israel. This is an astonishing blindness and abandonment of the West leadership and a cultural decline of an inconceivable magnitude. And then, as I said this morning, we have Obama and ISIS, or as he calls it, ISIL. And again, be sure to get, I'm sure there are some left, the CD of our interview with Michelle Bachmann on the back table. It's airing this weekend. And we talk about ISIS, and she spent August visiting half a dozen nations, in part to learn more about ISIS and ISIL. Why does Barack Obama call it ISIL? Because he's referring to the Levant. The Levant would include all of Israel and Jerusalem. That is the ultimate goal, is the obliteration, another Holocaust, the annihilation of Israel. And that's why he's using the term ISIL instead of ISIS. Now, we don't really have to worry about Israel. I mean, I'm very concerned about America. The reason we don't have to worry about Israel is because of Jeremiah 31:31. And God says there, as long as the fixed order of the universe remains, I will stand with my people Israel. Nothing's going to happen to them. Doesn't matter what pharaohs do, what generals, kings, Führers, mullahs, ayatollahs, presidents of the United States and other countries, doesn't matter. And after all, have you ever seen a Hittite walking around? Have you ever seen a Jebusite? Have you ever seen a Canaanite? No. They vanish off the face of the earth. Is America going to vanish off the face of the earth? Well, it may not vanish, but it may blend into a one-world system. We may lose our sovereignty and go into the Antichrist kingdom sooner than we thought because of what's happening thanks to this administration. It's indeed tragic. It's indeed deplorable, but It's fulfilling Scripture. It's fulfilling prophecy. Do you think we could go into the end of the end times with America strong and with Israel strong? No nation can be strong. The whole world has to be weakened so that a power broker can move in and say, I'm going to make the world good again. I'm going to pick up all the pieces. And then there are all these verses that warn. Obviously, I've emphasized the one, Genesis 12:3. I'll bless those that bless you and curse those who curse you, I will curse. We have Joel 3. God will judge the nations for their treatment of my people and for dividing up my land. And that is the one thing that picture after picture I've showed you shows the division of God's land. Land for peace, land for peace, land for peace, land for peace. 2 Chronicles 20:29, and the fear of God was upon all the kingdoms of those countries when they heard that the Lord fought against the enemies of Israel. God fights against those who are enemies of Israel. Right now, America is an enemy of Israel. Right now, as we speak. That doesn't mean we are. We certainly aren't. And there's certainly the remnant, one of them in our front row, Michelle Bachmann, who's standing strong for Israel. But unfortunately, we need more. It will come about in that day that I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the people. All who lift it will be severely injured, and all the nations of the earth will be gathered against it. And that's the important verse. Because again, we are fulfilling Scripture. All nations. It's not all nations except a huge Western power someday will stand with Israel, but all other nations, no, all nations will turn against. Barack Obama had to turn to continue to fulfill Scripture. Now, does that mean somebody could be elected in 2016 and turn it all around? Well, of course. Or are we so far late in this plan of God that that's not likely to happen? I'm not a prognosticator. I'm not going to speak into that. I don't know. Anything's possible, and with prayer, all things are possible. But as we speak, as this abuse continues and gets literally worse by the day, how can we be anything but a judged nation? And we are under judgment, I am sad to say. Now, I don't want you to go away with only that thought in mind, because here's what's equally important, is that you remain salt and light, is that, and I personally think, and in some of my conversations with Michelle, and I know what she's thinking about some of the things coming upon America, which I'm not going to go into now. If we don't look up, we can't look around. We can't. We've got to be looking up, or it's going to become too bleak. Because we're so far into the last of the last days. We're so far along. So you've been born for such a time as this. You are here on assignment. I keep saying that. You are here on assignment. You all have a different assignment. And one of those assignments is to go out and tell the truth. Go out and tell the truth of some of the things you learn wherever it is, here or any other place. And I hope you will do that. But God remains in control. He has a timetable. I believe that timetable is on overdrive. I believe it's speeding up. But I believe that He is coming so soon that we need not leave here today discouraged based on some of the things you've heard me share here, because that's not my intent. My intent is not to send you out discouraged, even though facts on the ground are a little on the discouraging side. I believe we can still make a difference. I believe we can still make a difference with our friends, with our families, by telling some of the inconvenient truth. And so I'm just going to close with what I often like to close with on the radio, that you would look back and thank Him, you will look around, serve Him, and you will look ahead and trust Him. You look up and expect Him. He is coming again, He's coming again, He's coming again. Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. Thank you for coming.